I stood frozen in the lawyer's office, my fingers gripping the edge of the chair. My sister sat across from me, her lips curled into a smirk, tapping her manicured nails on the table. She looked so proud of herself, like she had just won the lottery. "The house is mine now," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "You have nowhere to live." Her words hit me like a slap. My stomach twisted, but I refused to react. I glanced at my parents, waiting for them to say something, anything, but they didn't even look at me. My mother shifted uncomfortably, pretending to fix the hem of her dress. My father cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by the papers in front of him. They had signed everything over to her, and they hadn't even told me. I swallowed the lump in my throat. That house wasn't just a building to me, it was home. It was where I had spent my entire childhood, where I had laughed, cried, and grown up. It was where my grandmother had lived, where she had planted her favourite roses in the garden. And just like that, with a few signatures, it was gone. I turned to my sister. She was practically glowing, basking in her victory. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, enjoying every second of my pain. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask my parents why. Why would they do this to me? But deep down, I already knew the answer. They had always favoured her. And now they had given her everything, leaving me with nothing. Or so they thought. I had always loved that house. Every corner of it held a memory. The front porch where I used to sit with Grandma, listening to her stories. The kitchen where Mom taught me how to bake cookies, even though I usually ended up covered in flour. My bedroom, where I had spent countless nights whispering secrets to the glow-in-the-dark stars on my ceiling. It wasn't just a house, it was a part of me. But none of that seemed to matter. My sister had somehow convinced my parents that she deserved it more. She spun her usual stories, playing the victim, making herself sound like the one who had always struggled. It didn't matter that she had been spoiled her entire life, that she had always gotten everything she wanted while I was expected to understand and adjust. She was their golden child, and I was just there. When I found out what they had done, I thought it was a mistake. Surely they wouldn't do something so cruel without talking to me first. I asked them about it, my voice shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. But my mother just sighed, like I was being unreasonable. "Sweetheart, don't make this a big deal," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Amy needs the house more than you do," my father added, not even looking up from his newspaper. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to make them see how unfair it was. I reminded them that I had always been responsible, that I had taken care of Grandma when she got sick, that I had poured my heart into that home. But they brushed me off. "Stop being dramatic," my mother snapped. Dramatic. That's what they called it when I asked for fairness, when I asked to be treated like I mattered. And that's when I knew. No matter how much I begged, no matter how much I pleaded, they would never take my side. They had already made their choice, and now I had to make mine. That same day, my sister threw me out. One moment, I was standing in what used to be my home, still trying to wrap my head around what had happened. The next, I was on the front porch, my bags at my feet, my sister standing in the doorway with a smug grin on her face. "Go figure something out," she said, folding her arms across her chest. "This house is mine now." I stared at her, waiting for her to realize how cruel she was being, waiting for even a flicker of guilt to cross her face. But there was nothing, just amusement. She was enjoying this. I turned to look at my parents, hoping, praying that one of them would stop this, that my mother would rush forward and tell my sister to stop being ridiculous, that my father would sigh and tell me I could stay until we figured things out. But they didn't. They just stood there, watching, silent. I felt something inside me break. For years, I had tried to be the good daughter. I never asked for much. I helped around the house. I took care of Grandma when no one else did. I worked hard, never caused trouble, always did what they expected of me. And yet, Here I was, standing on the sidewalk, my childhood home no longer mine, my family turning their backs on me as if I were nothing. The wind blew, making my skin prickle. I had nowhere to go, no backup plan. I had spent my entire life thinking this house would always be my home, but now my sister stood in the doorway like a queen on her throne, looking down at me as if I were a stranger. She leaned against the doorframe, her smirk widening. "You always thought you were better than me, didn't you?" she taunted. Well, guess what? I won. Then, without another word, she slammed the door in my face. I flinched at the sound. It echoed in my chest, louder than it should have been. I took a deep breath, blinking back the sting in my eyes. The sky had darkened and the streetlights flickered on, casting a dull glow on the pavement. My suitcase felt heavier than it should have. My legs felt numb, like they might give out at any second. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were steady as I scrolled through my contacts, stopping at one name. I pressed the call button, listening to the ring. "Hello?" a voice answered. I took one last look at the house behind me, then turned away. It wasn't over. Not even close. I wasn't going to fight. Not yet. Standing there on the cold sidewalk, my heart pounded with anger and betrayal, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't change anything. Screaming, crying, begging, none of that would bring my home back. My sister thought she had won, but what she didn't know was that I had been preparing for something like this for a long time. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before I scrolled to the number I had saved months ago. One I hoped I would never need. But now it was the only call that mattered. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "Mr. Carter, it's me," I said, my voice steady. "It's time." There was a brief silence before he responded. "I figured this day would come," he said. "Come by my office first thing in the morning. We have work to do." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'll be there." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. A sharp breeze brushed against my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was racing. For months I had seen this coming. My sister had been dropping hints, little comments about how she was handling things with our parents, about how she was making sure her future was secure. I had a bad feeling, but I never thought they would actually go through with it. Until now. That's why I had reached out to Mr. Carter, a lawyer who had handled my grandmother's estate. He knew the truth about the house. He knew things my sister and even my parents had clearly forgotten. And now it was time to remind them. I turned away from the house, not looking back. My sister thought she had taken everything from me. She thought she had won. She had no idea what was coming. The day of the official signing arrived, and my sister walked into the lawyer's office like she was the queen of the world. Dressed in her best outfit, she strutted across the room, head high, confidence dripping from every step. She didn't even glance at me. To her, I was already defeated. She took her seat, flipping her hair over her shoulder, and flashed a bright smile at the lawyer. "Let's get this over with," she said, reaching for the pen. "I have a housewarming party to plan." I stayed quiet, watching. My parents sat beside her, looking pleased with themselves. They still hadn't spoken to me since throwing me out. To them, this was just another day, another decision that benefited their favorite child. Mr. Carter, my lawyer, slowly shuffled the documents in front of him, his expression unreadable. Then, just as my sister was about to sign, he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and smirked. "Actually," he said smoothly, "that house was never theirs to give." Silence. My sister froze, the pen hovering over the paper. My parents exchanged confused glances. My father cleared his throat. "What do you mean?" Mr. Carter turned to me. "Would you like to explain, or should I?" I smiled for the first time in days. "Go ahead." He nodded and pulled out a thick file. "Your mother and father may have lived in that house for years, but legally they never owned it. It was left to their eldest daughter, her. he said, gesturing toward me. Your grandmother ensured that in her will years ago. The colour drained from my sister's face. That can't be right, she stammered. Mr. Carter slid a paper across the table. See for yourself. This is the original deed, signed and recorded long before your parents even considered transferring ownership to you. The house legally belongs to her. And always has. My mother gasped. My father rubbed his temples, looking like he had aged 10 years in a single moment. But my sister, she was shaking. Her perfect world was crumbling in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But they signed it over to me, she cried, her voice rising in panic. Mr. Carter barely blinked. You can't sign over something you don't own. Silence filled the room again. The confidence my sister had walked in with was gone. In its place was pure, unfiltered shock. I sat back, taking in the moment. Checkmate. The lawyer turned to me with a calm, knowing expression. He folded his hands on the desk and spoke clearly, his words cutting through the thick silence in the room. Because legally, this house belongs to her. For the first time, my sister looked nervous. Her smug smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of confusion. She blinked as if trying to process what she had just heard. What? She scoffed, shaking her head. That's impossible. My parents weren't any better. My mother's mouth hung open, her hands clenching the fabric of her dress. My father, usually so sure of himself, looked completely lost. I reached into my bag and pulled out a worn but carefully preserved document, the original deed. I placed it on the table and slid it toward them. My grandmother left the house to me in her will years ago, I said, my voice steady. She made sure it would always belong to me, not to my parents, not to my sister. Me. Mr. Carter nodded. This deed has been legally binding since the day she passed. Your parents never had the right to sign the house over to anyone else. Any agreements they made with your sister? Completely invalid. My sister grabbed the papers with shaking hands, scanning them desperately as if she could somehow change what was written. Her face turned pale. This can't be right, she whispered. Oh, it's right, I said, watching her crumble. My mother turned to me, her eyes wide with shock. Why didn't you say anything before? I let out a small, humorless laugh. Would you have listened? She looked away, guilt flickering in her eyes, but I didn't care. They had already made their choice when they handed me over to the streets without a second thought. My sister pushed back from the table so suddenly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. This isn't fair, she shrieked. You can't do this to me. I tilted my head. You mean the way you did it to me? She opened her mouth but had nothing to say. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. Legally, you have no claim to the house. You have no rights to the property. And considering you knowingly tried to take ownership of something that was never yours, I'd advise you to vacate the premises immediately. Tears welled up in my sister's eyes. She looked at my parents, but for once they had no way to protect her. I stood up and picked up the deed. This house was mine. It had always been mine. And now my sister knew it too. My sister turned pale. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the papers, scanning them frantically, as if searching for some loophole, some mistake that would undo everything. No. This has to be a mistake, she stammered, her voice rising in panic. This can't be real. But it was real. My parents sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. My mother's lips parted, but no words came out. My father ran a hand over his face, looking like he had just been hit by a truck. For the first time, they were speechless. Then, after a long silence, my mother turned to me. Why didn't you tell us? I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. Why didn't you ask before taking what wasn't yours? They had acted without thinking, without considering me, without even wondering if they had the right. Now they wanted an explanation? My sister's breathing became uneven. She slammed the papers down on the table and turned to our parents. Fix this, she demanded, her voice shrill. Do something. But what could they do? There was no fixing this, no undoing it. Mr. Carter calmly adjusted his glasses. Legally, there is nothing to fix, he said. Your parents never had the right to give you that house. And now that everything is clear, you'll need to leave the property immediately." "No," she screamed, shaking her head wildly. "This is my house. I already made plans. I was supposed to live there. She doesn't even deserve it." I crossed my arms and met her furious gaze. "Oh? And you do? You, the person who threw me out without a second thought? You who laughed while I stood in the cold with nowhere to go?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She knew she had no argument. Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, just peace. My parents sat in stunned silence, unable to meet my eyes. Maybe they were finally realizing the truth, that their favoritism had cost them everything. My sister let out a choked sob and dropped into her chair, her body shaking. "This isn't fair," she whispered. I gave her a small smile, tilting my head. "That's exactly what I thought when you locked me out of my own home." She collapsed into tears, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care. With one signature, I officially reclaimed my home. The pen felt surprisingly light in my hand as I signed my name at the bottom of the final document. My heart pounded not with fear but with satisfaction. The house was mine. It had always been mine. And now there was no one left to challenge that truth. I placed the pen down and exhaled slowly. Mr. Carter nodded, sliding the papers into a folder. "Congratulations," he said. "It's officially yours again." I turned to my sister. She was still sitting there, frozen, her eyes locked on the documents as if staring hard enough could make them disappear. Her face had lost all colour, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. She looked completely shattered. I leaned back in my chair, taking in the moment. Then, with a calmness that mirrored her own cruelty, I said the words she had once thrown at me without a care. "Now you have nowhere to live." Her head snapped up. Tears welled in her eyes and she let out a shaky breath. "No, you wouldn't," she whispered, her voice breaking. I raised an eyebrow. "Wouldn't I?" She had made me watch as she took my home. She had laughed in my face, knowing I had nowhere to go. She had mocked me while I stood helpless on the sidewalk. Now it was her turn. Tears streamed down her face as she shot a desperate look at our parents. "Mom? Dad?" They said nothing. My mother looked down at her hands, ashamed. My father stared at the table, unable to meet her eyes. Even they knew she had brought this on herself. The office door opened and 2 security officers stepped inside. Mr. Carter had arranged everything. "Miss Carter," one of them said firmly, "you need to leave the premises immediately." She shook her head wildly. "No, please. This is a mistake. She can't do this to me." But I could. And I was. One of the officers gently took her by the arm, guiding her to her feet. She struggled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please, I have nowhere to go." I gave her a long, steady look. "Neither did I said softly. She stopped fighting. Her shoulders slumped and her face crumbled in defeat. I watched as she was escorted out of the office, her sobs echoing down the hall. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. As I stepped back inside my house, I let out a deep breath, taking in everything around me. The familiar scent, the way the light poured through the windows, the creak of the wooden floors. It was all mine again. I ran my fingers along the wall, feeling the warmth of my childhood memories wrapped around me like a protective shield. This house had always been more than just a building. It was a part of me, my safe place, my home. And after everything, I finally had it back. But this wasn't just about the house. It was about justice. For years, I had been pushed aside, treated like I didn't matter. My sister had always been the favorite, always given everything she wanted while I was expected to accept whatever was left. My parents never thought twice before choosing her over me. And when she convinced them to sign over my home without hesitation, it proved what I had always feared. They had never truly valued me. But today, everything changed. I had watched my sister crumble under the weight of her own actions. I had seen the realization dawn on my parents' faces. the guilt settling in as they understood what they had done. And while they sat there in silence, helpless for the first time, I had walked out victorious. She had laughed when she threw me out. She had mocked me, humiliated me, treated me like I was nothing. But in the end, the house was never hers to take. And the moment she realized that, the moment she felt that same helplessness, was the moment she finally understood what she had done to me. And now I finally had my justice. I walked through the house slowly, running my hand along the furniture, letting the moment truly sink in. This was my home. Not because of a piece of paper, not because of a lawyer's words, but because it was always meant to be. I wasn't the weak, powerless girl they thought I was. I smiled to myself, a feeling of peace washing over me. This wasn't revenge, this was balance being restored.